How ancient Persians kept ice in the desert all year. Section 1. Setting the scene in ancient Persia. Imagine the vast Persian Empire unfolding beneath a sky so bright and pitiless it seems to burn away every hint of moisture. In this land of deserts and cracked earth, you might expect nothing but parched lips and the constant search for water. Yet if you could drift back in time, if you could walk softly through the dusty alleys of an ancient Persian city, you would discover something astonishing. Rising from the plain, like a giant pale beehive, stood the Yakhchal, a monumental dome of mud brick and clay that defied the seasons. To the untrained eye, it looked almost primitive, a heap of hardened earth with a peculiar slope tapering to the heavens. But to those who built it and tended it, this dome was a promise that in the blistering heart of summer, ice would still exist. In the hush before dawn, when the last shreds of night clung to the horizon, teams of workers emerged from their homes to begin their silent labors. They moved in practiced rhythms, hauling baskets woven of reeds and lined with straw. Some baskets carried chunks of ice, carefully gathered from mountain slopes the night before, still locked in frost. Others contained fresh straw to replenish the thick insulating layers within the Yakhchal's cavernous belly. Each man knew his role, and each footstep had been repeated 1,000 times by his father and grandfather. There was something almost sacred in their diligence, as though the act of preserving cold itself was an offering to the gods of the desert. As you stand beside the dome, you might notice the curious feel of the clay beneath your fingertips. It was no ordinary mud. Persian builders perfected a blend of sand, ash, egg whites, lime, and goat hair. Once applied, it hardened into a material nearly impervious to heat and water. They called it sarouj. When layered hand over hand, it sealed the Yakhchal from the sun's cruelty. You might run your palm along its surface and feel a faint coolness radiate outward, as if the dome were exhaling a secret breath. But it was not only the walls that made this icehouse miraculous. Beneath the dome, a vast pit descended into the earth, sometimes to depths of 2 stories. There, the precious ice was stored in layers divided by straw. The pit's depth protected it from temperature swings, and the narrow vent rising through the dome carried warm air upward and away. Even the angle of the dome's slope was precise. He would check the straw partitions, ensure that no leaks had formed, and note the thickness of the remaining ice. In this way, the Yakhchal endured season after season, offering its promise of cool relief. Even as the city around it grew and changed, new streets laid down, new walls built, the dome remained the same. Merchants traveling along the silk routes knew to look for it. Caravans arriving weary and sunburnt would pause to barter for a handful of precious ice to cool a water skin. Children waited in the shade, hoping for a shard of ice as a treat. The dome was woven into the fabric of life, as ordinary to its people as the rising sun. In the evenings, when the desert winds grew still and the last markets closed their shutters, the Yakhchal seemed almost to hum with stored cold. No matter how fierce the day's heat, it held a hidden winter beneath its layers of earth. If you walked past it as night descended, you might feel the breath of chill air wafting through the vent, a reminder that in this place, centuries before mechanical refrigeration, humans had already found a way to keep summer at bay, designed to deflect midday rays, so no single patch of wall bore the brunt of the sun for long. In the earliest hours of the day, before the city stirred, the Yakhchal was already hard at work, fulfilling its quiet purpose. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky in pale ribbons of rose and gold, you might have seen the overseer of the ice house emerge from a low doorway at its base. He would pause to survey the courtyard, his eyes lingering on the neatly stacked baskets and the workers bent over their tasks. In one hand, he held a wax tablet, already inscribed with dates and measurements, the tally of ice brought in during the night, the rations allocated to each household or merchant, the reserves remaining. In this place, ice was not merely a luxury, but a ledger, a sign of prosperity, and careful stewardship. Under the hush of dawn, there was something almost comforting about the familiarity of this ritual. Every day in the coldest months, teams would set out to harvest ice wherever they could find it. Sometimes that meant traveling high into the Zagros Mountains, where the snow packed tight into crevices and could be pried free with picks. Other times, they waited until the shallow canals froze during the night. Then, by lantern light, men would cut slabs from the glassy surface, working quickly before the sun returned. They wrapped each slab in straw and layered them in carts for the slow journey back to the city. No one doubted the difficulty of this labor. The path from the mountains was steep and treacherous, and carts broke their wheels on hidden stones. Yet the ice must come, and it must come early, before the thaw crept in to steal it. If you asked one of the ice gatherers why he endured the cold and darkness, he might have smiled, showing a gap where a tooth had been lost to the cold, and said simply that a summer without ice was unthinkable. The Yakhchal itself was both warehouse and temple. Its dome rose above the settlement, like a reminder that ingenuity could bend even the harshest climate. The Persians did not see it as a curiosity, it was a necessity, a silent companion to daily life. Inside, where sunlight seldom reached, the air was always crisp and dry. When the overseer lifted the wooden hatch to descend the steps, he did so carefully, for a sudden rush of warm air could melt the uppermost layers. Section 2. The Origins of the Yakhchal. At the heart of this quiet marvel was the unassuming network of qanats, underground aqueducts that slipped through the earth like hidden veins. If you could step beneath the desert crust and follow their winding paths, you would discover cool, shallow streams gliding along channels carved by generations of skilled diggers. These qanats were the lifeblood not only of the fields and orchards, but of the Yakhchal itself. In the hush of pre-dawn, while the surface baked in the sun's memory, the qanats ferried water so cold it would sting your fingertips. This underground river was coaxed to the surface through clever shafts that rose like chimneys, their openings capped to preserve the chill. From there, the water was guided into shallow basins near the Yakhchal, where it would freeze on the coldest winter nights. Picture a moonlit evening in midwinter, when the air had turned brittle and sharp. The workers would gather around the basins, their breath rising in silver threads. By morning, a thin crust of ice would have formed across the surface, no more than a finger's width thick. And every dawn, that delicate sheet was broken and carried inside, layer by layer, day after day, until the pit of the Yakhchal brimmed with harvested cold. It was a practice as steady as the turning seasons, and for many families, it was the surest defense against the furnace of Persian summer. If you wandered through the city's alleys as the sun climbed higher, you would see water jars shaded by canvas awnings, market stalls draped with damp cloths to cool their produce. But even in this world of careful improvisation, the Yakhchal reigned supreme. Some described it as a palace of winter, a place where the heat could never quite conquer. Its walls, sometimes more than 2 meters thick, shrugged off the desert's assault. Even when midday shimmered like a mirage and the air quivered above the rooftops, the interior of the dome remained so cold that the breath of any visitor turned visible as they spoke. Children too small to help with the harvest were given special tasks, carrying fresh straw, sprinkling water over the packed layers to bind them together. For them, the Yakhchal was a place of wonder. In a land where the sun ruled nearly every hour of the day, here was a corner of perpetual frost. On festival days, the overseer might allow a small group inside to marvel at the pale blocks stacked in perfect tiers. They would press their palms to the ice and giggle at the numbing sting, imagining far-off mountain slopes they had never seen. In wealthier households, ice was used to make sherbet, the delicate syrupy drinks, flavored with rose water or pomegranate. A merchant returning from a journey across the plateau might be greeted by a servant carrying a shallow bowl, its rim crusted with frost. To sip it was to taste something almost miraculous, a promise that even in the hottest season, the world still held pockets of cold. Yet the ice was never frivolous. It preserved fresh cheeses and butter. It soothed fevers and heatstroke. It kept grain stores safe from insects and mold. In this way, the Yakhchal's gift was woven into the rhythms of survival itself. Some believed that the chill air contained a spirit, an unseen guardian who watched over the city's provisions. And though no records tell us precisely when the first Yakhchal was built, by the time Greek historians arrived to document the wonders of the Persian Empire, these domes were already old, already familiar. As you stand once more in the quiet courtyard at dawn, the overseer raises his lantern to inspect the workers' progress. He calls softly to the nearest man, who nods and hefts another basket of straw. The city has begun to stir beyond the walls. A rooster crows, a pot clatters. But within the Yakhchal, the hush remains unbroken. Here, where ice waits patiently for the furnace of the afternoon, the ingenuity of countless hands endures. The dome, with its simple curves and hidden depths, is both monument and machine. It is a testament to the idea that with patience, with steady work and shared purpose, humans could claim a little pocket of winter in the heart of the blazing desert. Section 3. Harvesting Winter Ice. Every year, as autumn gave way to the first chill evenings, the city began its preparations for the ice harvest with a quiet sense of ceremony. It was never proclaimed with trumpets or bright banners. Instead, it unfolded in small, practical steps repeated across generations. The harvest began not when the cold was at its deepest, but when the nights first turned sharp enough to leave a fragile skin of frost on the shallow pools near the Yakhchal. In these early days, the overseer of the ice house would gather his workers before dawn, reading from his wax tablet to assign each man his task. Some were dispatched to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, where hidden gullies held pockets of snow that persisted longer than the lowlands. These men traveled by donkey, carrying baskets lined with woven reeds and padded with straw. They knew the way by heart, narrow switchbacks that wound past ancient shrines and lone cypress trees, the same trails their fathers and grandfathers had climbed. The journey was slow and cold, but the reward was precious, each basket filled with chunks of ice, packed carefully to survive the ride home. Closer to the city, others tended the freezing pools. By moonlight and the faint glow of oil lamps, they skimmed the surface of the water to clear any dust or fallen leaves. Then they waited, stamping their feet to stay warm, listening to the silence of the desert in winter. As the hours passed, a delicate film would begin to form, a thin sheet of ice that looked too fragile to touch. Yet by dawn, it would thicken just enough to be lifted in broad, translucent panes. Each was carefully laid on mats of straw, then covered with more straw and weighted with stones to keep the wind from cracking it. The process was delicate and unhurried. No one rushed. A single misstep could fracture a whole morning's harvest. Children sometimes crept to the edges of the pools to watch, their breath curling in the cold, their small hands clasped in wonder as each slab emerged. Once the ice was secured, the teams loaded it onto wooden carts and began the careful return to the Yakhchal. In the pale morning light, you might see a slow procession of carts snaking across the plain, hooves muffled in sand, wheels creaking under the hidden cargo. To passers-by, the carts looked much the same as any other convoy of goods. But everyone in the city knew what was hidden under those straw blankets, the first promise of relief when summer returned. When the carts arrived, the overseer would direct the unloading. Each piece of ice was weighed and recorded, then passed hand to hand into the cool shadow of the dome. Inside the Yakhchal, a team of workers arranged the slabs in tidy layers, sprinkling straw between them. Their movements were practiced and nearly silent, a choreography honed over countless winters. Even the youngest boys understood their part, fetching fresh straw, patching cracks in the storage pit, bringing water to douse the dust. Section 4. Engineering Genius. How the Yakhchal stayed cold. Though the harvest of ice was a feat of perseverance, the true marvel lay in how the Yakhchal itself kept that harvest intact for months. From a distance, the dome appeared almost plain, a pale bulge on the horizon, blending into the color of the earth. But up close, you could trace every line of ingenuity in its construction. The Persians had no machines to cool the air artificially, no steel beams or concrete. Instead, they relied on principles so elegantly simple that they seemed almost like a kind of magic. The walls were the first secret, built in concentric layers of sarouge, the special clay mixture of sand, lime, ash, egg whites, and hair. They formed a barrier against heat that few structures of their time could rival. More than 2 meters thick at the base, they absorbed the sun's rays during the day and released them slowly after dark. If you pressed your palm to the outer wall at midday, it might feel hot. But step inside and you would find a chamber so cool and dry that your breath came out in a little cloud. Then there was the dome's slope. Rather than rising in a smooth hemisphere, it tapered at a steep angle, catching only the gentlest touch of the midday sun. No single patch of the surface remained in full light for long. As the sun moved, shadows flowed over the walls like slow water, never allowing heat to build up in any one place. High above, a narrow vent pierced the dome's apex. From this opening, warm air drifted upward, creating a steady circulation that pulled cooler air into the storage pit below. The floor was just as critical. Deep beneath the dome, the pit where ice was stored had been dug into the earth itself, sometimes as far as 2 full stories down. This subterranean vault was lined with clay and packed soil, both to insulate it and to prevent seepage. Even when the desert air above climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, the pit remained close to freezing. It was said that in the hottest weeks of summer, the overseer would descend the steps and pause halfway, feeling the air grow crisper with each stride down. Once the ice arrived from the harvest, it was stacked in neat tiers. Workers sprinkled straw over each layer to slow melting and to wick away moisture. Between the slabs, they left narrow gaps to allow air to circulate. No detail was overlooked. If the straw became damp, it was replaced at once. If the walls showed the faintest crack, new sarouge was pressed into place. Even the vent at the top had a clever cap that could be adjusted to control how much warm air escaped each day. For all its sophistication, the Yakhchal did not feel like a grand monument. It was built not to impress, but to serve. Merchants came to its door carrying small tokens of payment: copper coins, bolts of cloth, baskets of dates, and left with chips of ice wrapped in damp cloth. Doctors visited to fetch ice for poultices, to cool feverish children. On festival days, cooks arrived early to collect the slabs that would be crushed into sweet drinks. Each person who stepped inside felt the same hush descend, the same sense that here, in this hollow dome, time itself was slowed. In the evenings, when the workers were gone and the last sunlight skimmed the walls, the Yakhchal stood in perfect stillness. Its vent exhaled the day's heat, the thick walls sealed tight against the coming dark. And deep within its heart, the ice waited, silent, patient, and unmelting. A hidden promise that, even in the fiercest desert, there would be a place for winter to endure. Section 5. The role of qanats and water management. Beyond the dome itself, the secret of this improbable cold lay hidden under the ground in an even older marvel, the qanats. These ancient subterranean channels were as essential to the Yakhchal's success as its walls and dome. If you could have wandered beneath the earth with a lantern, you would have found yourself walking in narrow tunnels carved by generations of laborers, some just wide enough for a man to crouch and scrape away silt with a wooden spade. The qanats began far from the city, in the foothills where snowmelt trickled down through gravel and sand. There, water seeped into long horizontal shafts and followed gravity's patient pull, flowing for miles before emerging into the lower settlements. In many places, it surfaced only briefly, filling basins or irrigating gardens, before vanishing underground again. For the Persians, these channels were more precious than any road or fortress. They turned desert scrub into fields and orchards. They kept wells full, and they fed the Yakhchal, enabling it to store ice where no ice should ever last. Each qanat was dug in stages, a series of shafts spaced like beads on a string. From above, you might see these shafts as a line of small circles in the sand, each an opening to a cool darkness. At dawn, workers checked them for blockages using simple tools, a rope, a bucket, a wooden pole to dislodge debris. In winter, when the water emerged, colder than any air outside, it flowed into shallow ponds dug beside the Yakhchal's base. These ponds were built with low mud brick walls to contain the precious runoff and to spread it into a thin sheet that froze quickly overnight. It was a system born of scarcity, an answer to the challenge of coaxing life from a landscape that offered little. The qanats delivered not only water, but the promise of survival. In a single day, a well-maintained channel could provide enough flow to fill all the freezing ponds, ready for the next dawn's harvest. If you had walked to the edge of the city before sunrise, you might have seen shadows stooping at each shaft in the qanat line, tending the flow with practiced motions. Some of these men were employed by the city, their wages drawn from communal funds. Others worked in service of wealthy families who held rights to sections of the channels, inheritances passed down through generations. No matter their standing, all shared the same patient respect for the old systems. A qanat was never finished. It was always in need of clearing, shoring up, patching where the walls began to sag. Even in times of drought, when crops withered and fountains fell silent, the qanats would often yield a trickle of cold water, enough to keep the Yakhchal supplied. Some people believed this resilience was a kind of blessing, proof that the underground veins of the earth could never be fully exhausted. Others simply saw it as a testament to generations of quiet labor. When the first thaw came in spring, the overseer of the Yakhchal would stand by the main pond, watching the water eddy under a thin crust of ice. He would touch the surface with a finger, feeling how much colder it still ran than the morning air. In his ledger, he marked the measure of flow and calculated how many more nights of harvest could be gathered before the ponds grew too warm to freeze. This final stretch of winter was precious. Every slab of ice laid away in those weeks would help the city endure the summer months, when the qanats, though still running, would bring water too warm for storing fresh ice. So the channels and the dome worked together, each completing the other's purpose. Above ground, the Yakhchal waited to enfold the harvest. Below, the qanats carried the promise of cold across the miles of dust and stone. And when the workers lifted each slab from the freezing pond and carried it through the Yakhchal's dark doorway, they were taking part in a ritual as old as their memory, an act of endurance that had outlasted empires. Section 6. Ice for everyone, class, and access. But while the Yakhchal and its qanats served everyone in some way, access to the ice they sheltered was not always equal. In the Persian cities and towns where these domes rose, ice was both a common necessity and a quiet marker of privilege. Who received how much and when was determined by wealth, status, and old agreements that stretched back for generations. If you had stood at the Yakhchal's entrance on a summer morning, you would have seen the procession unfold, the merchant steward arriving first, bearing a small clay seal to prove his household's right to a daily ration. The physician who came next, whose allotment was reserved for fevers and childbirth, and the wealthiest patrons, who sent servants with brass vessels to carry whole slabs home. The overseer of the Yakhchal kept a ledger for each family. Every delivery, every exchange, every measure of straw was recorded. When disputes arose, and they always did, he would unroll the scrolls and point to the marks beside each name. For the poorest households, the arrangement was more fragile. They relied on shared access, pooling small coins or goods to purchase ice together. Sometimes, on the hottest days, families gathered under the dome's eaves hoping to buy a chipped fragment left behind by wealthier customers. In the hush of the Yakhchal's chamber, as the overseer weighed each portion, the difference between privilege and need was unmistakable. Yet, despite the quiet inequity, there were times when the dome's bounty was shared freely. At the height of certain festivals, like Nowruz, the New Year, local rulers might decree that every household receive a measure of ice. On those mornings, the lanes around the Yakhchal filled with the laughter of children carrying little bundles wrapped in cloth. For once, everyone could taste the cool sweetness of sherbet, or hold a shard against their wrist to banish the heat. In times of scarcity, when drought shriveled the qanats and the freezing ponds lay empty, the overseer faced hard decisions. Whose ration would be cut? Which households would have to make do without? It was said that an honest overseer could earn respect across the city simply by how he answered these questions. Women played their own part in the ritual of ice distribution. In wealthier families, it was often the matriarch who decided how much would be set aside for storage, for cooking, or for the care of the sick. In humbler homes, mothers might rise before dawn to line up with their neighbors, bartering a few measures of lentils or a length of hand-spun wool in exchange for a chipped remnant. There were also itinerant sellers, men who purchased portions of ice to resell by the handful in shaded corners of the bazaar. They carried their cargo in straw-lined chests, calling out in soft voices so as not to melt the precious wares with their own breath. For those unable to afford a visit to the Yakhchal, a small sliver of ice, bought in the market, might be the only relief from the smothering heat. Standing in the Yakhchal's entrance, you could feel the hush of these exchanges. Each transaction, each measure weighed and recorded, was part of a delicate balance. The dome itself made no distinction between rich and poor. It kept its cold with equal indifference. But the human arrangements that grew around it, ledgers and privileges, rationing and charity, wove a quiet hierarchy into the heart of its purpose. And so, even in the act of preserving something as simple as ice, the Yakhchal mirrored the world around it, a place where survival and social order were bound together, each depending on the other, to endure the long summer to come. Section 7. Culinary Delights and Chilled Feasts. Once the ice was safely stored and rationed, it began its second life in the kitchens, gardens, and banquet halls of the Persian world. Though today we might think of ice as a mundane convenience, in those ancient summers it was a luxury that transformed daily life, and no occasion better revealed this than the elaborate feasts and ceremonies where chilled treats were the centerpiece. In the homes of merchants and noble families, ice was used to prepare sherbet, fragrant syrups diluted with cold water. These drinks were flavored with rose petals, pomegranate, or sour cherry, each carefully strained and poured over crushed ice, so that the first sip was both sweet and startlingly cool. On the hottest days, guests would recline on carpets spread beneath canopies of woven reeds, while servants moved quietly among them, filling shallow bowls with shaved ice. A hush always followed the first taste, an astonished pleasure that even here, in a courtyard ringed by dry hills, the cold could be summoned at will. In smaller homes, ice served simpler purposes. A jar of milk placed on a bed of chipped ice would keep fresh for days longer. Soft cheeses and clotted cream survived the worst of the summer heat. If a mother feared that a child's fever would rise past saving, she might send a relative to the Yakhchal to barter for a shard of ice to lay across the child's brow. Cooks found endless uses for the cold. During festivals, they prepared jugs of vinegar, cooled with ice, to pickle vegetables quickly. They churned fresh dairy into primitive ice creams, sweetened with honey and flecked with saffron. Some recipes survived only as fragments, mentions in scrolls or travelers' diaries, but each testifies to a culture fascinated by the quiet magic of cold. At weddings or New Year celebrations, the presence of ice was a statement. It signaled prosperity, foresight, and generosity. When a host served guests chilled sherbet or presented fruit arranged on beds of snow, it was more than hospitality. It was a sign that the household had prepared well, that no expense was spared in honoring tradition. Yet even these festive uses never lost their practical edge. Ice kept grain weevils at bay. It preserved medicines that would spoil in the heat. It cooled clay jars of drinking water drawn from qanats that, in midsummer, ran warmer than bathwater. In this way, the line between luxury and necessity blurred. Children learned to look forward to the first ice of the season as much as any holiday. As dawn broke over the city's flat roofs, they would gather near the Yakhchal's entrance, clutching small dishes or scraps of cloth. If the overseer was in a generous mood, he might hand out a splinter of ice to each child, a cool treasure to be sucked carefully before it vanished into a trickle on their tongues. Even travelers on the silk routes spoke of these chilled delicacies. A merchant from Sogdia recorded in his ledger how, after a week, crossing the salt flats, he arrived to find a dish of rosewater, sherbet, waiting for him, cooled with ice so clean it seemed to glow. In a place where life was often a contest between endurance and deprivation, such moments were more than comforts. They were small miracles. And so, through every summer, the ice stored in the Yakhchal found its way into countless hands. Whether in a grand banquet hall or a humble kitchen, it softened the brutal heat and gave people a glimpse of winter's gentler side, proving that ingenuity could turn the harshest landscape into something just a little more merciful. Section 8. When ice became political. Yet the story of ice in ancient Persia was not merely about comfort and survival. It was also about power. For rulers and governors, the ability to distribute cold became a quiet tool of influence, one that could bind subjects to their loyalty or remind them of their dependence. When a new governor took office in a distant province, it was customary to proclaim his arrival not only with proclamations and coins bearing his seal, but with generous public gifts. Among the most prized of these was ice. In the height of summer, when the sun scorched the walls and the wells turned tepid, he would order great slabs of ice brought from the Yakhchal and distributed to the markets. The gesture did not go unnoticed. To the weary traders and farmers pressed shoulder to shoulder in the bazaar, a handful of ice was more than refreshment. It was a sign that the new administration cared for the well-being of its people, that order had returned. In times of drought or famine, the distribution of ice became an act freighted with symbolism. When the canals ran low and harvests failed, the overseer would appear in the square with the governor's steward. carrying a ledger heavy with official seals. House by house, they would announce the measure each family could receive. Even if the ration was small, just enough to chill a single jar of water, it carried a message. The rulers had planned. The rulers provided. This subtle form of governance extended into diplomacy. When envoys arrived from neighboring kingdoms, Armenians, Sogdians, or envoys from the Indus Valley, they were sometimes greeted with cold drinks and sweetmeats kept fresh on chipped ice. No matter how polished their own courtly traditions, few could hide their surprise at this cool hospitality in a place so far from any snow. Over the decades, more than one scribe recorded the effect such gestures produced. Alliances softened, rivalries tempered, tribute pledged. Even religious festivals were occasions to wield this quiet power. During Nowruz, the New Year holiday, city officials often declared an amnesty on ice debts. For 1 week, families whose rations had been curtailed could come and claim their share freely. Children in particular awaited this moment. In the pre-dawn stillness, they would line up clutching clay bowls, the glow of lanterns reflecting in their wide eyes as they waited their turn. When the overseer emerged with the first baskets of pale shards, a hush would fall, as if everyone sensed that, in that instant, the boundary between hardship and relief had been briefly lifted. In this way, ice was never just ice. It was a currency of goodwill, a measure of foresight, and a demonstration of competence. A governor who let the Yakhchal fall into neglect, who allowed the qanats to silt up or the harvest to dwindle, risked more than discomfort. He risked losing the trust of the people. For in the rhythms of the Persian year, ice was a promise, kept or broken. So each slab that disappeared into the shade of a merchant's storeroom, or melted into a child's cup of sherbet, also carried the weight of power. Each handful was an unspoken reminder that beyond the walls of the Yakhchal, a delicate balance held the city together. A balance maintained by clever hands, enduring labor, and the quiet authority of those who understood that even the smallest comforts could shape the destiny of an empire. Section 9. Odd uses, medicinal and ritual applications. Not all the uses of ice in ancient Persia were practical or political. Some belonged to the realm of belief, where the cold was thought to hold hidden powers that could heal the body, temper the spirit, and even protect against misfortune. In the modest clinics that served most towns, physicians trained in the teachings of Hippocrates and local herbal traditions agreed on one point. Fever was an excess of heat, and heat must be balanced by cold. When a child's skin grew flushed and her breath came in ragged sighs, a family might send a relative to the Yakhchal for a ration of ice. Wrapped in clean linen, the shards would be laid across the child's forehead, chest, and wrists. Observers swore they could see the fever retreating, the child's color returning, as the chill leached away the dangerous heat. More elaborate treatments called for ice, mixed with vinegar or crushed mint, applied in compresses. Some healers even believed the cold vapors themselves carried a purifying virtue. When the Yakhchal's vent exhaled its slow breath in the evenings, a few families would gather close, inhaling that crisp draft, as if it contained the essence of health. The uses of ice went further than medicine. Certain rituals marked the passages of life: births, weddings, funerals. And in each, the presence of cold held symbolic meaning. A newborn was sometimes presented with a tiny chip of ice to touch against the lips, an offering to cool the transition from the womb's warmth to the world's harsh air. In marriage ceremonies, A shallow basin of ice water stood near the couple as they exchanged vows, reminding them that even passion must be balanced by calm. In funerary rites, ice had a quieter role. When the bodies of the respected dead were prepared for burial, small pieces were placed in earthen dishes nearby. It was said that the cold kept the soul settled, while the family gathered for prayers. These practices were never codified in royal decrees. They survived in whispers and habits, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. Some believed ice could ward off misfortune in more direct ways. A merchant embarking on a long caravan journey might press a sliver of ice to his lips before leaving, asking for safe passage across the sun-blasted roads. A pregnant woman in the last weeks of confinement might keep a vessel of ice in the corner of her room to cool the oppressive air, and perhaps to soothe the anxieties of childbirth. And always, there were the superstitions that clung to the Yakhchal itself. Children told each other that spirits lived within its dome, silent watchers who guarded the harvest. If you listened closely at night, they said, you could hear these beings whispering through the and no sensible person would dare. Though no records survived to confirm whether the overseers believed in such things, few ever dismissed them openly. After all, the Yakhchal was a place where winter lingered long past its time, where something ordinary, water, was transformed into a thing so rare and necessary that it seemed to hover just this side of the sacred. So while the physicians measured out their compresses, while mothers pressed cool cloths to feverish brows, and while the curious waited outside the dome's shadow, everyone understood that ice was more than a tool. It was a reminder that the natural order could be coaxed, never commanded, and that in the patient labor of storing cold, a little mystery always remained. Section 10. The trade networks supporting ice culture. Beyond the city walls, where caravans wound their way across the plateau, a different kind of commerce flourished, one that quietly supported the culture of ice. It was easy to imagine the Yakhchal as a self-contained marvel, standing alone in its ingenuity. But in truth, it was only the final link in a long chain of labor and exchange. Without the traders, porters, and craftsmen who moved ice, and the tools to harvest it, the dome's chambers would have stood empty. When winter descended and the first freezing nights arrived, small expeditions set out from the settlements near the foothills. These men were not employed by any single household. They were independent ice gatherers, men who leased grazing land for their donkeys and mules, men whose fathers had traded snow and straw since childhood. Their journeys took them to mountain gullies few others bothered to climb, steep defiles where the sun seldom touched the snowdrifts until late spring. Once the ice was dug free, packed in layers of straw and bound with twine, it needed a reliable path home. Here, too, old networks played their part. The trails themselves were owned in sections by different clans or guilds. A fee was paid at each way station for the right to pass. At night, the caravans camped beside stone cisterns where water was stored, and the ice was checked for melt. Each morning, before resuming their descent, the men inspected every basket. A cracked seal or damp straw meant trouble later. When the ice reached the plains, it sometimes stopped first at way stations or small depots. Mud brick warehouses cooled with damp reed mats. Here, merchants might buy part of the load outright, to resell in distant towns. Others negotiated contracts with the overseer of the main Yakhchal, promising to deliver a quota of ice by the season's end. These agreements were a quiet economy of their own, marked by seals pressed into clay and witnessed by scribes who traveled with the convoys. Alongside the ice moved everything needed to handle it: rolls of woven straw matting, tools for carving and lifting blocks, lengths of soft rope to secure the loads. Basket makers wove fresh liners each year, knowing that any fraying or weakness could spoil the harvest. Potters shaped the broad, shallow jars used to serve sherbet. Even tinsmiths found work crafting small chutes and troughs for melting and washing the ice before it was carried into the Yakhchal's depths. In this way, entire villages and trades thrived on the culture of ice, though few ever saw the inside of the dome itself. A boy who grew up tending pack animals might never taste a cup of chilled pomegranate syrup. A woman who spent her days twisting straw into mats might never feel the cold breath of the Yakhchal's vent. And yet their labor shaped every shard that found its way to a merchant's table or a feverish child's bedside. Travelers on the Silk routes sometimes wrote of these exchanges with puzzled admiration. How was it, they wondered, that a land so dry and inhospitable had devised a system to move cold across so many miles? How did so many hands, some paid in silver, some in barter, coordinate without a single authority to command them? The answer lay in an understanding as old as the desert itself. No household, no matter how wealthy, could sustain the work alone. Survival required quiet cooperation, agreements struck over coals at the way stations, debts carried over from one season to the next, and the unspoken knowledge that the summer would be long and merciless. So the trade networks became an invisible lattice, holding the Yakhchal aloft. From the first shovel of snow to the final measure weighed on the overseer's scales, every step was part of a shared endeavor. And though few records celebrated these laborers, the cold that waited in the heart of the dome was their true testament, proving that even in the harshest places, a little abundance could be coaxed into being, if enough hands reached for it together. Section 11. Desert Survival Beyond Ice. While traders and harvesters wove their quiet network across the land, those who worked within the Yakhchal itself developed their own rhythms and customs. Habits so old they seemed to belong to the dome as much as to the people who served it. If you stepped through the cool doorway on any given morning, you would have seen a world governed by careful routine and a shared respect for the stored cold. The overseer, whose authority was marked by the small seal he wore on a leather thong, arrived first each day before dawn. By lamplight, he checked the condition of the walls, ran a hand over the layers of straw to feel for damp, and inspected the vent high overhead. Only when satisfied did he signal for the others to enter. Even in the depth of summer, the men kept their voices low, as if to disturb the hush was to waste some of the precious cold. Tasks were divided with the precision of ritual. The younger laborers carried fresh straw from adjoining sheds, while older men, those whose backs had grown stiff with years of lifting, inspected the blocks of ice for cracks or seepage. If a slab showed signs of melting too quickly, it was moved upward, closer to the entrance, where it could be distributed first. Each piece of ice was marked in the overseer's ledger with a small sign indicating when it had been laid down. These marks guided the rationing. Older ice was always used before newer harvests, ensuring that nothing spoiled unseen in the lower layers. A special curved hook, shaped from iron and worn smooth by decades of hands, was used to slide each block into position. Younger workers watched carefully when the hook was wielded. It was said a single careless movement could topple a stack and cost a week's provisions. Once the day's orders were prepared, the men began carrying ice out to the courtyard, where merchants and messengers waited with their baskets lined in reed matting. Transactions took place with quiet formality. A steward presented his seal. The overseer recorded the measure in his ledger, and the block was lifted, sometimes by two men working in practiced unison, and set gently into the waiting vessel. No one hurried. The ritual was as slow and deliberate as the freezing of the ponds themselves. Children too small to lift or carry were given simpler duties. They swept the entryway, sprinkled water to settle dust, or tore worn straw into smaller pieces to be used as packing. Many of them would grow up to take their parents' places, learning each detail by observation long before they were entrusted with the work. In some families, knowledge of the Yakhchal passed from father to son, uncle to nephew, like a quiet inheritance. The overseer, for all his authority, was not exempt from toil. When records were completed and the last portion delivered, he made one final circuit of the dome before closing up for the day. He checked the vent, tapped the walls in a slow, methodical circle, and knelt to feel the straw with his bare hand. Only then did he extinguish the lamp and step back into the brightness of the afternoon. For those who labored here, the Yakhchal was more than a workplace. It was almost a living presence. They respected its moods, the way it exhaled cold more briskly in the early hours, the way the air grew still at midday. They believed that as long as they honored the old routines, the dome would reward them with the gift it guarded, an unbroken store of winter's memory. So day after day, season after season, the same motions repeated. The ledgers filled with fresh notations, the straw was renewed, the blocks of ice shrank slowly in the dark, and above it all, the vent watched the sky, drawing off the heat in a single silent plume, as if the dome itself were breathing, content to shelter its secret through another turning of the year. Section 12. Historians debate the scale of ice use. As the months passed and the desert heat reached its fiercest, the Yakhchal revealed just how much it could outlast the sun. In late summer, when the streets shimmered and the market stalls sagged beneath heavy awnings, those who stepped inside the dome often drew a sharp breath at the contrast. The air there was not simply cool, it was dry, clean, almost startling in its clarity, as though each visitor had entered a different season altogether. Visitors came for many reasons. A midwife, summoned to tend a woman in the last days of her pregnancy, might stop to collect ice wrapped in linen. A merchant's servant, sweating beneath a load of dates, came to barter for a slab that would keep fruit fresh until evening. Even travelers from distant regions, Arabia, Bactria, the southern ports, would stand in the doorway for a moment, adjusting their turbans and blinking in wonder. For them, the Yakhchal was a rumor made real, a place where the desert could be undone, if only for a little while. And while the overseer never spoke of pride, a small satisfaction often crept into his gaze as he watched newcomers feel the dome's chill. He knew the long chain of effort behind that sensation. The midnight harvests, the caravans crossing dry plains, the patient labor of every man and child who tended straw and measured blocks. The cool hush was no accident. It was the sum of hundreds of hands working in unison. In these hottest weeks, the pace of distribution increased. The ledgers grew crowded with notations, each line marking another measure taken, another promise kept. The overseer learned to read the city's needs like a physician reading a pulse. Here a neighborhood with a cluster of fevers, there a wealthy household planning a marriage feast. Elsewhere, a caravan master preparing to depart before dawn. The routine was never casual. Each morning, the workers entered the dome in single file, voices subdued. They moved among the stacks of ice with the same care they had learned in winter. As one elder often said, the dome demanded respect, whether it was full or nearly empty. Its quiet never changed. Outside, life continued its slow, drowsy struggle against the sun. Wells sank lower, fountains trickled to a stop, and the scent of hot dust hung over the city. But within the Yakhchal, time seemed to pause. The walls held their cool, exhaling it in soft currents that slipped around ankles and wrists like the touch of invisible water. Children sent to fetch ice often lingered at the threshold, savoring the cold before they were shooed away. Some grew up to remember those moments more vividly than any festival. The dimness, the hush, the sense of stepping into a hidden refuge. Even in old age, they would describe the sensation as a kind of magic, a memory of winter held safe inside clay walls. Among the city's physicians, it became common knowledge that no other storage method could rival the Yakhchal. Clay jars buried in the earth stayed merely cool. Shaded cellars became too damp. But here, in the dome with its perfect balance of dryness and circulation, the ice survived when everything else withered. And so, as the weeks dragged on and the heat grew oppressive, the Yakhchal remained a steadfast witness to human persistence. Each dawn brought more footsteps to its door, more ledgers marked, more small acts of relief carried out into the glaring day. And inside, beneath layers of straw, the ice lay patient and unchanged. Proof that the most ordinary element could become precious when carefully tended, and that even the desert's tyranny could be gentled by ingenuity.
Section 13. Decline and Transformation Over Centuries. As the calendar edged toward autumn, the Yakhchal began to empty. Each day, fewer slabs remained stacked in their neat tiers, and the straw underfoot grew thinner, littered with small fragments of melted ice. To an untrained eye, this dwindling might have looked like a simple fact, just the last of the summer's supply, gradually consumed. But to the overseer and his workers, it was something more, the closing of a cycle that had defined the city's survival. In those final weeks of heat, every portion became more carefully measured. The overseer's ledger was pored over each morning, and the smallest debts were settled before the new harvest began. Merchants sent apprentices to confirm their accounts. Physicians tallied the rations they had drawn during the worst of the fever season. Even the itinerant sellers who hawked cups of chilled sherbet in the bazaars came to declare what they owed, laying out coins that had passed through 100 hands. No one wanted to begin the New Year's harvest with a ledger in disorder. Among the people who worked the Yakhchal, it was said that a careless reckoning could sour the next season's ice, though perhaps this was simply a way to remind everyone of their duty. In any case, the custom endured. As the store of ice shrank, the records grew precise and orderly, a testament to the quiet discipline that held the system together. Outside, the air began to soften. The midday heat still pressed heavily on the city walls, but the nights carried a faint chill that hinted at winter's return. In the dawn hours, when the first breezes stirred dust along the alleys, the overseer sometimes climbed to the top of the dome to inspect the vent. From there, he could see the entire plain, pale fields waiting to be turned under, caravan tracks fading into the horizon, and beyond it all, the shadowed foothills where the first snow would soon gather. The workers, too, felt the change. Their tasks grew slower, less urgent. The last slabs of ice were handled with particular care, as though each represented not merely refreshment, but the culmination of all the season's labor. When the last block was carried out into the courtyard and set on the weighing table, the men paused in the dimness, feeling the hush in their bones. It was a moment of satisfaction, but also of humility. However well they planned, however many baskets they packed, the harvest always melted. The ice never lasted forever. Its disappearance was as much a part of the cycle as the first night of freezing water in the ponds. Once the final measures had been distributed, the overseer oversaw the cleansing of the dome. All the remaining straw was gathered and burned. The floors were swept with reed brushes. The walls were inspected for cracks. If any repairs were needed, they would be completed before the new harvest began. In this way, the Yakhchal was ready to receive winter again, empty and expectant. Among the city's families, this quiet ending was often marked with small observances. A mother might save a last shard of ice to cool the season's final jar of sherbet, offering it to her children as a farewell to summer. An elder, rising before dawn to sip water still chilled from the last ration, might murmur a brief prayer of thanks. No official ceremony marked the moment when the Yakhchal stood empty. And yet, in its own way,
The city acknowledged that the cycle had run its course, and so the dome waited, silent beneath the paling sky. The great vent drew in the first breaths of cooler air. The clay walls, scrubbed clean of dust, began to leach away the last traces of summer warmth. Once again, the Yakhchal was nothing more than an empty chamber, an earthen promise that when the cold returned, it would be ready to gather and protect the fleeting harvest that kept the desert at bay. Section 14. Rediscovering Yakhchals today. With the arrival of the first true cold, the Yakhchal stirred back to life. It did not happen all at once. No single morning heralded the change. Rather, the shift unfolded gradually, in small signs that the season had turned. Frost forming along the outer cistern walls, the shallow ponds crusting over by dawn, the qanats running colder with each sunrise. For the workers who had spent months distributing the last of the summer's ice, this was a time of quiet anticipation. Preparations began well before the first harvest. The overseer reopened the ledgers and recorded the start of the new cycle. Straw, freshly woven and fragrant with dust and sun, was carried into the dome in great bundles. Tools were inspected, iron hooks for lifting the blocks, wooden sleds for sliding them across the floor, wicker baskets lined with reeds to keep the harvest clean. Each implement had been used by generations, and each was mended again and again, its wear a record of countless winters past. Outside, families passed along the lanes, remarking on the thinness of the air and the sharpness of the wind. In the foothills, the first expedition set out to scout the shaded gullies where snow collected. Younger men traveled with elders who knew every hollow and crevice. They marked where the drifts lay deepest and how the meltwater trickled through the rock. All this knowledge, so humble and so precise, would determine how much ice the city would claim. When the ponds at the base of the Yakhchal began to freeze in earnest, the true work commenced. At dusk, the overseer ordered the qanat channels opened so water could flood the shallow basins. Through the long hours of the night, the water grew still. Frost spread across its surface, creeping inward in delicate spines. By dawn, a thin crust gleamed under the pale sky. Then the harvesting began, a practiced dance of lifting, stacking, and layering straw. Each night the ponds refilled, and each morning they froze, thickening the harvest slab by slab. Workers moved in near silence, their breath rising in white plumes. Children who watched from the alleys saw not only toil but a kind of ceremony, as though the city itself were welcoming winter's return. Sometimes the wind swept down from the mountains so cold that the overseer's hands went numb on the ledger. Yet the work did not pause, for each night of freezing counted. The more water the qanats delivered, and the more steady the temperatures, the greater the store that would sustain the city through the long summer ahead. Little by little, the Yakhchal filled again. Each tier of ice was laid carefully over straw, each layer pressed down to keep out air and heat. The darkness within the dome grew deeper and colder, and the vent exhaled small clouds of vapor as though the building itself sighed in relief. For the city's people, these weeks were marked by a mixture of labor and celebration. Families who could spare the coin sent boys to buy a fresh chip of ice even in winter, a small luxury to remind them that the harvest had begun. In the bazaar, vendors sold sweet syrups in anticipation of the warm days when ice would again transform them into sherbet. Elders recalled seasons when the ponds froze so thick they yielded enough for 2 years. Others remembered leaner winters when a sudden thaw brought disappointment. But this year, like every year, hope returned with the cold. And as the final loads were stacked in the Yakhchal's depths, the overseer made one last round of inspection. His lamp moved across the packed tiers in the clean clay walls, pausing here and there to test for gaps or signs of weakness. When he was satisfied, he closed the ledger, knowing that for now, the work was done. Outside, the foothills lay white under a brittle sky. In the lanes and rooftops, the city turned its face to winter. And hidden behind thick walls, the first harvest of ice waited. Silent, immaculate, and ready to carry life through the coming heat.
Section 15. A nighttime walk to the Yakhchal. When spring finally broke over the desert, it brought a sudden riot of color and sound. Green shoots along the irrigation ditches, plum blossoms drifting across the market roofs, the clamorous return of caravans bearing silk and spices. Yet inside the Yakhchal, the world remained unchanged. The darkness kept its steady chill. The air stayed dry and almost sweet, and the tiers of ice waited in their careful order. To step through the door even now was to slip into another season, a hidden reserve of winter, preserved against the year's turning. As the first warm days settled over the city, the dome resumed its familiar rhythm. Each morning, the overseer emerged with his ledger and his measured calm, the same quiet figure who had recorded the final block of the last harvest and the first slab of the new. Families sent servants with baskets lined in fresh straw, doctors came to claim their allotted shares, and itinerant sellers began their soft-voiced calls in the bazaar once more. If you had paused on the threshold, you would have seen how little had changed. The youngest boys still swept the floor before dawn, learning by watching the gestures of their elders. The older men still worked in near silence, lifting each block as though it were something too rare to be jostled. The tools lay in their accustomed places. Even the smooth hook for sliding ice across the floor had taken on the polished sheen of countless seasons. Outside, life quickened. Wheat ripened in the fields beyond the city. Musicians rehearsed for weddings and New Year celebrations. Caravans brought stories from the ports of foreign kings, new inventions, distant wars. But in the Yakhchal, each layer pressed down to keep out air and heat. The darkness within the dome grew deeper and colder, and the vent exhaled small clouds of vapor as though the building itself sighed in relief. For the city's people, these weeks were marked by a mixture of labor and celebration. Families who could spare the coin sent boys to buy a fresh chip of ice even in winter, a small luxury to remind them that the harvest had begun. In the bazaar, vendors sold sweet syrups in anticipation of the warm days when ice would again transform them into sherbet. Elders recalled seasons when the ponds froze so thick they yielded enough for 2 years. Others remembered leaner winters when a sudden thaw brought disappointment. But this year, like every year, hope returned with the cold. And as the final loads were stacked in the Yakhchal's depths, the overseer made one last round of inspection. His lamp moved across the packed tiers and the clean clay walls, pausing here and there to test for gaps or signs of weakness. When he was satisfied, he closed the ledger, knowing that for now the work was done. Outside, the foothills lay white under a brittle sky. In the lanes and rooftops, the city turned its face to winter, and hidden behind thick walls, the first harvest of ice waited, silent, immaculate, and ready to carry life through the coming heat. And so the Yakhchal stood, as it always had, silent under the wide sky, its clay walls warming in the afternoon sun. To a passer-by, it was only an ancient dome, a remnant of forgotten dynasties. But for those who knew its purpose, it remained something quietly miraculous. A place where winter lingered through the longest summer, where countless hands and patient labors turned dust and heat into a promise of relief. Even now, if you stepped inside and closed your eyes, you might feel the hush settle around you, the cool breath of old ice, the scent of straw, the memory of all the seasons that had come and gone. In that moment, you would understand. The Yakhchal was never just about preserving cold. It was about preserving hope.
and the simple belief that with care and persistence, even the harshest places could yield a measure of gentleness.